Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Urushi Sharma, Associate Professor, Department of Journalism and Media Communication from Jagannath University, Jaipur. This is in continuation with our series on driving force of the freedom struggle. In this session, we'll have a look at how Benjamin Horniman contributed to the freedom struggle. So let's begin. Now let us first look at who was Benjamin Guy Horniman. He was a British journalist and the editor of Bombay Chronicle in 1910. He began his journalistic career as a Portsmouth Evening Mail in 1894. Before coming to India, he joined Statesman, the Indian daily broadsheet newspaper in Calcutta. Daily Chronicle, Manchester Guardian Weekly, and he was also the founder of Press Association of India. Now let us look at his journalistic journey. In 1906, Horniman joined the Statesman as its news editor and assistant editor. From there on, in 1913, Horniman moved to Bombay to take up the job of the editor of the Bombay Chronicle. And in 1929, he started his own newspaper styled Indian Herald and its weekly Herald. Now, Horniman was one of the very few British reporters to write about the impact of the colonial rule and the authorities' failure in maintaining law and order. He also played a huge role in assisting Motilal Nehru to begin Allahabad-based newspaper The Independent, which was known for its radical stance and unabashed criticism of the British rule. So we see that why Horniman, we are studying the role of Horniman in the freedom struggle is because Horniman, even though he was British, he wrote about the impact the colonial power was having on the colony, and he also wrote about the authoritarian failure of the authority in maintaining law and order. At the same time, he also played a very important role in assisting Motilal Nehru to begin an Allahabad-based newspaper, The Independent. Now, the newspaper Independent had a very radical stance, and it criticized the British rule. Now, Independent was started by Motilal Nehru, who who belonged to an affluent family, and he, along with his son Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, had an exposure to the Western world, the Western ideology of freedom, liberty, equality. So, these people were now starting up their newspapers in order to mold the opinion, public opinion, and to put across their own viewpoints to the masses. The Bombay Chronicle was a nationalist newspaper which was founded by the political leader Firoz Shah Mehta, and it became the mouthpiece of the freedom movement in India and the scanting attack on the British. So it became a mouthpiece for the freedom movement, which meant they attacked the British rules, British policies, British programs. So Horniman wrote extensively on how the spirit of nationalism had spread like a wildfire amongst those who had never been politically active. So Horniman in his book Amritsar and Our Duty became one of the first Britishers to have pointed out Hindu-Muslim unity, and his subsequent events in Punjab served to strengthen the feeling of unity between the two great sections of the Indian people so greatly that never again will the ruling power be able to look at the principles of divide and rule for their good. Coverage of Jallianwala Bagh tragedy included smuggling photographs of the massacre and its aftermath. He broke a series of stories in the Daily Herald, a British publication exposing the cruelties of the empire on the British. So we have to take into account, or it's important that we highlight that Horniman, through his writing, he wrote extensively about how the vernacular press, how the leaders were able to spread the spirit of nationalism amongst the masses, and it was spreading like a wildfire. Now, in his book Amritsar and Our Duty, Horniman highlighted the Hindu Muslim unity, which was being broken up by the Britishers' policy of divide and rule. So much so that in his book he wrote that because of the series of events that were taking place in Punjab, like Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, were not able to uh, break the trust of the two communities on each other, right? He always wrote about how the policy of divide and rule was never being able again to um, say help any of the colonial power to use it for their benefit, right? As far as coverage of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy is concerned, Horniman was clever enough because he had an exposure to the Western world when we talk about the reporting. So he was able to smuggle and get the pictures of the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, and he then used it in the international media, which is the newspapers back in Britain, right, like the Daily Herald, to expose the uh, atrocities that the British colonial power was having or was doing on the Indian population. So he wrote a series of stories which highlighted the wrongdoings of the British government through the pictures, through the write-ups in the in the Daily Herald. Now, Horniman also served as a vice president of the Home Rule League under Annie Besant, while also calling for a satyagraha campaign against the Darokian Rowlatt Act. So he became so much Indian that he not only became one of the founder members and the vice president of the Home League along with Annie Besant, but he also started campaigning for satyagraha against the Rowlatt Act. Mahatma Gandhi formed the Satyagraha Sabha to launch the national campaign against the Rowlatt Act, and Horniman became the vice president. Now it was his decision to print an unofficial smuggled report on Jallianwala Bagh massacre in defiance of the government's censorship that resulted in his deportation to United Kingdom by British colonial government. Now we have to take into account that Horniman was very courageous in nature. He was not say he never gave it a second thought. The impact the story that he was going to carry out in the newspaper would harm him. Now, he wanted the world to know about the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh or Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. So he smuggled report, he smuggled the photographs, and he got away with the government censorship, which meant that we have to first show what pre-censorship, show what we were going to publish, and then only we were giving the right to publish. So he did not show what he was going to publish, and then because of his act he was deported to United Kingdoms. Now let us look at the ideology of Horniman. We have seen how he has worked. Now let us see what were his ideology. And he was one of the few British reporters who wrote about, he understood the impact the colonial rule had on the people, and he wrote about it. He continuously wrote about how the colonial powers or authorities were a failure in maintaining law and order. Then he also acted as a resource person to help people start their own newspaper in order to promote their views on liberty, freedom, and equality. One such person was Motilal Nehru, whom he helped and assisted in coming out with the Independent, which was a radical newspaper, and he uh, criticized the British rule. Now, Bombay Chronicle was a nationalist newspaper which was founded by Firoz Shah Mehta, but it became the mouthpiece of the freedom movement in the country. Now let us look at the landmarks of Benjamin Horniman. Now, his writings, he wrote extensively how a spirit on uh, sorry, he wrote extensively on how the spirit of nationalism had spread like a wildfire among even those who were never politically active. So he wrote how a nation, a colony was getting up for a nationalist movement, right? He, in his book Amritsar on Our Duty, he became the first British reporter to talk about Hindu Muslim unity. He then further wrote that the subsequent events which were taking place in Punjab were not able to dilute the feeling of unity amongst the two great communities of the country. And he also highlighted that the ruling power will never be able to use the concept of divide and rule again for their own good. Then he, on the coverage of Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, he was a fearless reporter. He made sure that he brought the atrocities of the Britishers. He talked about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy. He exposed it to the outer world. So he made sure that he was able to smuggle the pictures of the massacre, and he then got it published in on the, yes, in the national in the Daily Herald, a British publication, so that the world knows about what was the massacre and how and condemn Britishers for their act. Now, Horniman also served as a vice president for the Home Rule League, which under Annie Besant, and he also was in charge of the national campaign, which was say which was launched by Mahatma Gandhi, a satyagraha campaign against the Rowlatt Act. Then uh, it was his decision and to unofficially print the report on the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh tragedy without getting it say approved by the authorities, so that people get to know about what was the impact and at what length the massacre has taken place, so that the Britishers or the British government is condemned all around. So, because of his acts of being fearless, writing, sorry, being fearless, writing fearlessly, clearly, straightforwardly about the nationalist freedom and about the mismanagement of the British government to maintain law and order. He became one of the person who was instrumental in bringing about, say, instrumental in mobilizing the spirit of nationalism and mobilizing the cause of freedom movement, right? He, through his writings, through his acts, he made sure that the acts of British government, especially Jallianwala Bagh tragedy, massacre, is reported, is brought to light to the outside world, so that it can be condemned because of the act. The Britishers can be condemned because of the act, and that is why he was deported and sent back to Great Britain. Thank you.